We'll get started. Thanks everyone for being here. Depends on where you are. It's afternoon for me, but morning for probably most of you. We're excited to have Deanna share with us, so I'm just going to hand it over to you, Deanna. And would you like me to pray for you before you get started? Would that be
Sure,
okay?
I'd love that. Yeah.
So, Creator, thank you so much for our time today and this morning. Would you settle our hearts and our minds and our bodies and our spirits to hear from you this morning through Deanna? Would you use all of who she is to speak about your glory today and to teach us, but our ears and our hearts be open to hear from you, Holy Spirit. And we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Awesome. Thank you, Amy. All right. Well, to go ahead and get started, well, first of all, thank you everyone who decided to join this seminar. I really appreciate you guys coming in to hear what I was going to share here and what Creator is leading me to share. I think it's a really important and relevant message, especially with what's happening now. I'm definitely going to be talking about social justice. Kind of what I wanted to touch on is a little bit of the history about the border crisis, actually, because I think that also ties into this. But we'll also be talking about racial inequality in this country, and about how obviously for a lot of us as Indigenous people that does affect us. It's something that has disproportionately affected us, as well as other groups. I think to begin, I just kind of wanted to give you a little bit of information about myself for those of you who don't know me. So I'm White Mountain Apache from my tribe's from Northern Arizona. And I just give a little background on myself because this kind of also shaped my beliefs and how I feel now. I was not raised on the reservation. I was actually taken in by a really, really close family friend who was actually a white woman. She was much older too. She was actually a World War II veteran, one of the first women in the Women's Army Corps during World War II. She went on to be a union representative for labor unions and basically spent her whole life in service of other people. Like, she never really had any kind of actual career that was just purely working. Everything she did was in service. Like, for labor unions, she was working with with the amalgamated clothing industry and a farm workers union, trying to make sure everyone got fair wages. And of course, that put her in touch with migrants a lot. And she traveled all over the United States and the South doing that work. She actually worked with and a lot of really prominent people. She was really good friends with Cesar Chavez. She had marched with Dr. King and met him. She had quite a phenomenal life. Like, her entire life was in service to other people. And I think growing up with her really shaped a lot of what I believe, because I've always really had a heart for justice. And I think I definitely get that from her. And so basically that's kind of given me a lot of the knowledge that I have, is just learning from her. But another thing is the fact that I actually live right on the US-Mexico border. I live in a small town called Bisbee, Arizona, and it's right on the border, southeastern Arizona. The border fence is like 5 miles from where I'm at right now. And so, having pretty much lived here most of my life, I'm really familiar with a lot of the things that have happened in this community, and a lot of, we've gotten a lot of news of things that have happened that, for one reason or another, didn't actually really make national news. And so these are things that if people were more aware of, I think they would be a lot more educated on the border crisis and where we stand with that. So I think I'm going to go ahead and touch on the border crisis first, because that is one part of our talk today. I also am definitely going to touch on social justice as well, and what we can do as Indigenous people, or as Christians, like as followers of Creator, like what we can do for our communities, and how we can just help to try to make things better, because even though especially a lot of us being minorities, it kind of seems like things are stacked against us, we do still have power through Creator. So let me go ahead and see here. Now, the first thing, and I'll have a few questions for discussion too. I'm going to go ahead and just jump into a little bit of history of the border crisis, and actually kind of give you some history that's a little bit problematic, because a lot of what's actually been created, a lot of the crisis, and with the cartels in Mexico and Central and South America, have been emboldened and empowered by our own government, and that's not something a lot of people think about or talk about or even know about. So to kind of just start here, oftentimes the people who have tried to cross into the US are citizens of countries that are, like I said, are deeply affected by cartels. Like whether it's infighting within cartels, struggling for power with each other, corruptions through all levels of government. Like there are some countries like where it's up to the presidency corrupt, and there's extreme poverty all around for everyone too. A lot of countries just are really suffering right now, and there's so many more issues that it would take a long time to really get into, but those are just kind of like the main ones, really. So the US has been complicit in the escalation of this violence through government overreach and attempt to infiltrate the cartels by providing them with the means to continue the reign of terror on these communities. Like, I know that kind of sounds like a bold statement, but it's something that a lot like really needs to be acknowledged to really understand why so many migrants have started, or so many immigrants have tried to come here. Now, immigration, the number of people trying to cross illegally, actually, the number did go up after 9/11. And here's basically why. So after 9/11, a lot of the violence in Central and South America escalated. President Bush actually he started that war on drugs, which was part of it was creating the Drug Enforcement Agency to combat this issue that we've kind of been known about for a long time, like what they call narco terrorism, which is defined as the attempt for traffickers to hinder the enforcement of anti-drug laws through violence or threat of violence and extortion. So basically, the idea was, oh, this is a major problem now. We need to close our borders down. We need to fight the cartels. So he basically got that started more recently, even though this has actually been going on for a long time. Let me see here. So this led to countless instances where the DEA would attempt some sort of raid or undercover operation or something to arrest cartel members. But unfortunately, this often resulted in several scandals and an immense loss of life that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Like if they had just not even gotten involved in the first place, a lot of these would not have happened. So there was actually, in a sense, more damage done than any good coming from this. So overall, this war on drugs has caused an increase of violence in cartel-controlled areas, with really devastating results on those communities. Which, again, this is part of why a lot of people are trying to come here, which to me gives me reason to empathize with immigrants trying to come here, because they're trying to escape a problem that we, like a fire that we kind of helped stoke. So that I know that gets a little complicated, but just to give you here's an example of one of the big scandals that happened that didn't really. It's considered one of the bigger scandals in regards to this issue, but even then, it really didn't make a lot of national news. A lot of it was actually local around here, though. This particular incident, I should say, actually happened in my area, and so now the one I'll go talk about in 2010, there was what was called the ATF gun walking scandal, which was part of Operation Fast and Furious that was started by the U.S. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. So they were running sting operations in the area of southern Arizona between 2006 and 2011, and that was mostly in the Phoenix and Tucson area. A lot of it was in Tucson, which is about an hour and a half from where I'm currently located, and it's the largest city in this area. So the way that this particular operation went was the ATF purposefully allowed licensed firearm dealers on this side of the border to sell weapons to illegal straw buyers. And straw buyers are basically people who were not actually the intended owner of the weapons. They had illegal intentions for those weapons, which in this case would have been people purchasing weapons for use for the cartels. So they did this with the hopes that they could link weapons and link those weapons, but based on their serial numbers, to different drug cartels so that they could arrest them. So they did this with over 2,000 firearms, that's a lot of firearms in the hands of someone like cartels. That's a lot of destruction that's possible there. And in the end, after this failed operation, only 710 of those were actually ever recovered. So there's about 1,300 plus guns floating around out there, and who knows how many people that they've killed and how many lives that those have ruined that we put in their hands willingly and knowingly. Now, so the weapons that were found were used in crimes on both sides of the border. So there was a lot of people, even on our side of the border, who were affected by this too. Now, the operation was meant to just be kept secret, and it was never actually going to be uncovered publicly. The only reason that it was because in 2010, a U.S. Border Patrol agent by the name of Brian Terry was murdered in the desert near where I'm at right now, by the cartel using one of those weapons. So because of that, there were some whistleblowers who finally came out and revealed what was actually happening. And so that, I remember reading about that at the time and thinking like this should be a lot bigger news than it was, and it really wasn't. And so I don't think people were really understanding exactly what all of this meant, but there was a lot of destruction that happened as a result of this, and essentially nothing ever really came of it. They disbanded the operation. There was never anybody who was like held accountable for any of it. It was just they let it go. They just wiped it off like it was fine. So it's because of operations like this that a lot of issues in these countries have really started to escalate since like 9/11. That's not to say that the U.S. is completely to blame for all of this, but there's definitely some responsibility there, in my opinion, that should be at least acknowledged. So kind of to go a little further back in the history, the different communities and countries in Central and South America have suffered too, since some of these issues do, like I mentioned, they trace back to the war on drugs that the CIA was waging back in the 1980s. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to take out the cartel lord Pablo Escobar and his Medellin cartel. But despite the fact that he was killed in 1993, the issue was not resolved. And in fact, it pretty much, someone else took power and it still escalated. So all of that time, money, lots of deaths, and they killed Escobar, but it didn't stop anything. So basically, because of as a direct result of this, I do really heavily empathize with these communities, because another thing is they're not just immigrants, they're not just foreigners or just whatever. I relate to them too because they're indigenous people. The people of these countries in Central and South America, they were colonized just like we were. They're the descendants of Spaniards and Italians and all these people who came here and killed people and wiped out cultures here just like us. They were living in the Americas for thousands of years before colonization. And so now it's almost like they're being held hostage in their own ancestral lands. And then to kind of go into another issue regarding the border crisis, I think a lot of people aren't too aware of as well, is the fact that the border line, the attempt of the current administration, soon to be previous administration, of building that border wall, really was causing a lot of division too, because there's a lot of tribes whose ancestral lands actually cross both sides of the border. Like you have the different Atom tribes, Yaqui, Apache, Kickapoo, or just some of the tribes that I can name right now, who have their reservation over the borderline on both sides of the border. Like for example, I know the Tohono O'odham Nation right here on the border, they have a huge chunk of their reservation in Mexico too. And it used to be, before 9/11 and even a little bit past that. Oh, and see in the chat there, we didn't cross the border, it crossed us. Absolutely. It's exactly what happened. And basically it used to be that the people could walk across, and there wasn't even like a fence really, not like there was no real concern over the security. They could pass by foot or drive from one side of the border to the other, because that was their land, that was their reservation. Now that's much more difficult, and with the building of this border wall too, a lot of really important sacred sites have been destroyed, and that's just another example of colonization doing what it does, and it really has been affecting all these different groups and tribes. And that's not the only tribe that's affected, but I would say that, especially because I'm here in Arizona, that's probably the most prominent one, because the Tohono O'odham Nation is very large. And so that's one of the biggest things here. So what I want to kind of go into, and this is going to lead into our first question soon, I promise. Then it's a lot of information. But I wanted to talk about asylum seekers, because this is relevant to what's happening with the border crisis, as far as families being separated, kids being put in cages. And so just kind of going a little bit of that history real quick too. Since 1980, the United States U.S. law allows for non-U.S. citizens to present themselves at a port of entry and request asylum without fear of being criminalized, turned away, or separated from their children. Asylum grants protection to those who can demonstrate that they face persecution, violence, or threat of threat of death due to their race, their religion, nationality, political opinion. There's other factors too, but those are probably the four biggest ones. And so basically these rights were incorporated into international law too, following World War II as a result of the 1951 Geneva Refugee Convention, which was actually adopted by many nations in regards to like how they could handle refugees in the event of another crisis, of course, after what happened in Nazi Germany. There was a huge refugee crisis then too, of course. Now, the current administration has violated this law continuously, which is not only illegal, but it's an absolute violation of human rights. According to the ACLU, at least 2,654 children have been separated from their parents. And many of these children have been subjected to food deprivation. They've been subjected to unsanitary conditions. Like a lot of them, they're not even being provided like soap or toothbrushes or anything like that. And there's been so many instances of sexual assault by the ICE agents who were assigned to watch them. The New York Times actually just reported on October 21st that 545 children can't even be currently located. And that is just gross negligence. That is, I don't even have words for that. That is just something that's just completely awful. So basically all of this though kind of is going to tie into my first question here. And so if you want to, if we want to discuss this or put it in the chat, or if anyone wants to mute themselves and answer it too, that would be awesome. But first, especially if this is something you haven't really thought a whole lot about, what stops you from feeling solidarity with border immigrants? What motivates you about this issue? Does anyone have any kind of input or thoughts about that? Oh yeah, I'll put the question in the chat here real quick. One moment. Because I know it might take a moment to think about. Just here we go. It's in the chat.
I think what demotivates me is a sense of powerlessness. And then I don't even know how to begin to change what's happening. And then, which isn't exactly your question, but borders on it. And then I think motivated is just like, people shouldn't be treated like this, right? Like it's not right. So That's what's in me.
All right, thank you. Anyone else have any kind of thoughts or ideas about this?
I do a bit. So some of this isn't really new to me. I did the Los Angeles Urban Project years back, and we looked at border issues, and that was the first time I heard a lot about this stuff. I think what motivates me is that the people on the other side of the border that we were working with, they became not just other people, they became friends. And so I work a lot with or used to, and I still have friends down there, but with COMPA, the sister organization in Mexico. And so what motivates me is that they're not just like other people or whatever, like they've actually become very, very close friends, and the issues that they deal with and that affect their lives now are impacting me, because we're just really, really close, or we've become close over the years. And so yeah, I hear a lot of the stuff that's going on, and I think it's difficult to discuss it in the majority population of like my other friends, because they don't know these things, or they're not willing to hear these other things that you talked about, because it's a difficult idea, I think, to grasp that, to realize that, we're part of the issue.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very true. And it really does change perspective once you know people who are leaving that situation. And then I know because where you live there too, or where you lived in Southern California, it makes sense that you would hear about that too. I feel like a lot of the information about the border seems to kind of stay around the border, which it shouldn't, because I mean this is something. I mean, with as far as like the migrant children being separated from their parents, that did make national news, but then there are so many people who just were indifferent about it, and that was, I mean, that has just been mind-blowing to me. Does anyone else have any thoughts about it?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it pushes against what we're told about American exceptionalism, and so it's easy to believe, or it shouldn't be, but to just think that that's fake news, because how could the United States ever do anything? Well, we are all sitting here knowing that the United States has been doing this for however many hundreds of years. So
yeah. And then like even like the topic of immigration, that's even biblical too. Like one verse I wanted to cite too was Leviticus 19:33-34, which says, when a stranger resides in your land, you shall not wrong him. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as one of your citizens. You shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And there's quite a few verses that kind of have that same kind of along the same lines. And what really has been kind of hard for me, I think, especially since, I mean, the United States is not a Christian nation, but a lot of evangelicals like to profess that it is. And so they'll say that, and then like still be completely indifferent to this crisis, not have any kind of empathy for the people who are suffering and coming here and exercising their legal right to request asylum, and just demonizing them. And it's just something like, that's just been something I've wrestled with a lot too, like have had a really hard time with, because that's just like, I don't know, like how you could follow Creator and not have that kind of love for his people, because ultimately it always becomes an us versus them scenario. But the thing is, we were all created in his image, we're all his people. So like you would think, coming from a huge nation that wants to say that we're super Christian, that we would have a lot more empathy, and we don't overall. And that's just I think when we get into it now, we'll kind of like what you said, Megan, about feeling kind of powerless. That's kind of like what's really hard about it, is the situation really does kind of feel powerless. Like, what can we actually do about it? I am going to go into some ideas I have about how we, as whether it's as minorities, as Christians, like how we could possibly try to make that change too. But yeah, so as far as like the border crisis, that's something I really just wanted to touch on, because it's not something people know a lot about. Like, okay, I see your see in the chat there, John said lack of exposure stops me. I don't have to think about the detention center in New Mexico in my daily life. And that's true. Like, I think it's kind of like, if you don't see it, you don't hear it, it's not happening. And that kind of makes it a lot easier for a lot of people to just, I don't want to say write it off, because in some cases, just the fact that it's not spread widely and not shared widely, it's you don't know about it. And that's one of the worst things about it too, is just the fact that there's just not a lot of information about it out there. Like, I've heard some pretty crazy stories about cartel violence that I would think like, oh, this should have been like really big news. Like, I remember I want to say it was maybe about 10 years ago, around the time this Operation Fast and Furious is happening. There was a town that I can't, I'm trying to remember the exact scenario. I'm going to try to find the information to cite it later on. But I just remember, this is basically a local story, not even a huge local story for whatever reason, but not too far from where I currently live, there's a stretch of highway heading from the city of Cananea, northern Mexico, in the state of Sonora. And along this stretch of highway, in order to kind of show its power, because there was like some infighting and civil unrest in this area. The cartel kidnapped like I think it was about 80 people, decapitated them, and left their bodies scattered along this stretch of highway for a mile. And that wasn't news. It wasn't. And you would like, and that blew my mind too. I remember reading this tiny article about it in my local news, something that happened like less than 2 hours from where I'm at right now. And it was just like a little thing. And I think part of that too is I think a lot of us have that kind of idea that it's like, well, it's happening over there. They have all this violence happening. It doesn't affect me. It's just how it is. But again, this all ties back to we kind of helped a lot of this happen. So it's just really hard. Here, let me check the chat real quick here. Okay, Anna wrote, no, it doesn't feel like there's an immediate direct impact on my life, giving into a false sense of out of sight, out of mind. Absolutely. That's basically how it is. Let me see here. And then, we've got a chat here from Celeste. And Celeste is my cousin, and she's Tana Atom. Says, my lack of power as an Atom and trans person demotivates me. I could speak hours about the many border issues affecting my tribe and others, but it goes nowhere. My voice is not wanting to be heard by the majority. And that's true, too. A lot of people like from these tribes also feel like they're powerless, too, because of that. Like, no one's wanting to hear about their struggle. And that's also just really hard. And oh, Heather, yes, it's hard to speak out when everyone chooses not to listen. Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people are just really quick to just like it didn't happen. So, but I'm definitely going to touch on how we could pray about that and what we could actually do to take some of that power back. The next thing I kind of wanted to go into, because this is all going to kind of tie together at the end here, is kind of talking about social justice too, what that means to us, and what we can do about that too. Now, just to start out, social justice, what is it? A lot of people kind of wrestle with the idea of what it is. You know, there's a lot of commentary out there trying to say social justice is just some kind of buzzword to cause division or controversy, and that like it's referencing issues that are non-existent, and that's not true. So basically, the Oxford English Dictionary defines social justice as justice in terms of the distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within a society. It also just defines justice by itself as the quality of being fair and reasonable. So basically, as far as this particular topic, to kind of touch on, because as we know, colonization is America's original sin. And that has also included, of course, like racism, xenophobia, like all these things that are still prevalent now. And to kind of talk a little bit more as well, like there's, especially with this year, like there have been so many protests, after what happened to George Floyd or after what happened to Breonna Taylor. And some of the things, like a lot of people are so quick to dismiss that too, again, because I think because it's the idea of, oh, this doesn't affect me, coming from people who might be like the white majority, for example. I mean, as an Indigenous person, I mean, I've definitely felt like I've had bad experiences, and I believe it's because of my background, because of what I look like. I mean, I've been followed around in stores plenty of times. Or on a more extreme note, I've had interactions with police that were not good. Like one example was a little personal, but I'm going to share it because I think it's important. One example of this was when I was in college, living in Tucson. I was still going to the University of Arizona, and I was experiencing a mental health crisis. Like I wanted some help. I was feeling thoughts of suicide, and was wanting. I knew enough to just ask for help instead of just sitting with my feelings, and so I had actually called 911 asking for like an ambulance or someone to take me to the crisis center, because there's a crisis center there in Tucson. And what ended up happening, and I told them very specifically, like, I'm just having suicidal thoughts of hurting myself. I have no intention of hurting other people's. I know that's important to specify. And so when I walked out my front door, I was greeted by about 8 Tucson police officers, with all of them armed with guns in my face. And I walked down the steps and put my hands up. And even after they handcuffed me and put me on the ground, again, this is like treating me like like it was something criminal rather than something like I needed help. Because I had also I had previously had an interaction with Tucson police for the same reason, but the policewoman who showed up, and it was just like one officer, she was actually very she was understanding and helpful and got me the help I needed, so I thought I could trust them again. So this ultimately ended up with me going to the crisis center in handcuffs, and my roommates, they saw it happen. I mean, they wanted to film it because they thought they might shoot me, and we're listening to them making comments, and I mean, even once I was handcuffed and on the ground, completely incapacitated, there was somebody who kept a shotgun on me the whole time. Like, what was I gonna do? And so because of that, I have no problem believing the issues of police brutality in this country. I mean, I've heard a lot about that too, because like back to my grandmother who raised me. I mean, she, in her line of work, she worked with law enforcement constantly. She was also, after she retired, she was an advocate. She was one of in Arizona, we have what's called the CASA program, court-appointed special advocates, who are individuals who are assigned to work usually some really brutal cases, normally involving children who have gone through some extreme trauma or abuse. And they advocate for them. They take them to and from court appointments. They make sure that they feel safe. If the child is in court testifying, they make sure that they can help them like express what they need to talk about and make sure that they're safe and comfortable. And she did other things too. She did a lot of advocacy work in her retirement years. And so she was kind of in constant contact with law enforcement, and she would tell me like of things that she'd heard of and seen personally that were of like corruption in different different levels of law enforcement. And I think even she, to a degree, kind of felt powerless about it. I think because she was a white woman, so she acknowledged her white privilege, I think, in that sense of knowing that like, because I have this privilege, I know I can do these things, and used what she, like, her influence and people she knew to try to make things work, out for minorities who were being ignored by the police or even harassed by the police when it came to some really tough cases. So I had already kind of been aware about it, but then to see all of this that's been escalating, like as far as like police violence, it's something that it is real. It really does affect people. And I'm grateful they didn't shoot me that night. Because I mean, my roommates were scared that it might happen, and I was kind of wondering at that point. Um, and then yeah, my cousin Celeste, she was there, and then they actually had the audacity to go, and because Celeste was in our apartment, was not doing anything at all, and then they went into the apartment and started drilling her and harassing her, and for no reason. The call had nothing to do with her at all. But then I think it helps. One of my roommates was a white woman, and she came in and tried and really helped diffuse it, actually, because the rest of us were all people of color. Like my other roommate, she was black, so all of us were really uncomfortable. So when our white roommate came in, she was able to diffuse the situation and get them out of our apartment, basically. Yeah. Oh, then they made Celeste lift up her clothing, checking for weapons. And again, this situation had absolutely nothing to do with her or anything that was even criminal, but we were treated like we were criminals. So, and so that's just my experience I wanted to share. But of course, like the things that we're seeing, like nationwide, like there's the protests and then the rioting, whatever you want to call it. Let me see here. Let me go back to my notes real quick. As far as action, like as far as when you see these sort of things happening, what is everyone's thoughts about what they've been seeing? Has anyone here, if you're willing to share, ever, and I'll type it in the chat here real quick, but has anyone here ever experienced any sort of like discrimination based on their appearance? It doesn't even have to be with police, just in general, any situation that ever made them feel unsafe or uncomfortable. It could even be getting pulled over and being afraid something could happen. Like, has anyone here ever experienced anything like that? Okay, I'm checking the chat now. being followed, harassed, name calling. Yeah. Being followed by police officers while driving. Yep. Yeah. So like all of these things, it's really hard, as as a person of color, to kind of go about my daily life and worry about these things. Anytime I've gotten pulled over, I've been worried about it. I always try to make sure that no quick movements, keep my hands visible every single time. Yeah, so these things definitely do affect us in our communities. Now, for those of you here who or who I guess you could say identify as white, or white passing even, who may not be subject to this, have you ever seen these sort of things happen, or have you ever thought about what you might do if you were to witness this?
I've never witnessed anything, but I've thought about it because I do have a lot of friends that are darker in skin tones than I am. And so with everything that I've seen happen in the news, like, like I do worry about my other friends that do have to think about this on a daily basis and go through this stuff that a lot of you are putting in the chat. So it's something I think about, but I've never seen it happen in person.
Okay. Yeah. And that makes sense too. Like when you recognize that, like, you're not going to be put on the spot like people who are darker than you, that's it does become something you really think about a lot too. I see in the chat here people are saying they're not putting your hands in your purse, being followed around the store. Yeah, definitely. If I go into a store, I don't take a bag with me. Like, I don't carry a purse, or backpack, anything. I will not take that into the store, and I do not put my hands in my pocket unless I am reaching for my wallet to pay. Like, I actually try to keep my hands like visible to my sides intentionally, because I don't want anything to happen. So yeah, definitely feel that for sure. Let me see here real quick. Okay, I just want to read what Megan wrote here. It says, after learning how cops treat people of color, it has really changed how I feel about cops. They feel scary to me instead of safe. And if pulled over, I find I follow protocols now that I never did before. A few years ago in traffic court, a brown-skinned young man had the almost identical offense as mine. He was given a much harsher fine and punishment. Yep, absolutely. And it's interesting how once it's like a veil being lifted. Like, once you know actually how this stuff happens, you kind of, even if it may not actually affect you, you still kind of do the same thing too. So it totally makes sense, Megan, that you would do that now, because then now you're forced to think about it. Let's see here. Then I'm gonna read the last comment we got here. From Zelma. It says, I had a friend who, when his high school teacher asked him what he wanted to do after he graduated, he said he wanted to go to med school and become a doctor. The teacher's wife told him natives were just supposed to get drunk and commit suicide. Yep, that's a popular one too, and it's just horrible. So yeah, these are just a lot of things that just failure of the system. And of course, another big one too, like missing and murdered Indigenous women. They don't want to do anything about that. And so it's really hard. Like, we've always kind of especially because for me, having been I wasn't raised on the reservation, so I wasn't really raised with that mindset. My mindset, I could say, was a lot more white growing up. Was like, these are the people who are supposed to protect us. They're cops. They're good people. You can ask for help from cop. And now I absolutely will avoid them as much as possible. Like, it better be, I don't even, actually, even in a life or death situation, I personally would have a hard time wanting to call, honestly, just after my experiences. I know that we have some more comments here. I think everyone should check out the comments here. There's really great input being put in, but I know we're kind of running out of time too. So I did want to get to the last portion in here of what we could possibly do about these things. So I definitely am gonna, let me see, we're gonna kind of transition into that real quick. And I wanted to share another verse too. This is another verse that's basically related to social injustice. This one is from Isaiah 1:17, and it says, "Learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause." And so this here is where Isaiah is kind of reminding the reader of what it is that God seeks for the nation of Israel, and something that in the latter years was missing before they were taken into captivity, and it was part of the reason that the nation fell. They weren't doing good at all, and so God was telling them that they needed to learn to do good and to seek justice, which is basically saying that they obviously weren't doing that before. And so I think that's another really important verse. And let me find the other one I wanted to share real quick too. Here's another one, Psalm 82:3. "Give justice to the weak and the fatherless, maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute." Basically, I think that kind of tells you right there. I mean, there's a ton of verses about that in the Bible, in all different books, and it's like they're being disregarded from people who profess to follow God. But just to get to my the last portion here. So what can we do to put social justice in action? These are just a list of things that I've come up with. If anyone else has any input, I would love to hear about that too. So the first thing, I think prayer is vital. Like, we need to be praying for this. So I think one of the first things you could pray for is to pray to acknowledge the injustice. If it's something that you maybe have never thought a whole lot about, or this is for people who don't think about it much, period, they should pray to acknowledge it. Acknowledge, like, yes, I see the suffering in my communities. I see the suffering in my country. I see what our government is doing. Praying for Creator's justice, pray that He brings the justice to these people that have been wronged and to their families. Pray for the people who are hurt by injustice, victims' families and their communities, because there's just so much hurt from generations, like hundreds of years of trauma, and we just need to pray for healing. And I think also really important is to pray for unity. The sin of injustice does cause people to respond differently, sometimes peacefully, as we've seen with peaceful protest, and other times not, where we've seen with riots. And actually, to kind of go back into that, a lot of the big riots that have been happening weren't even incited by the protesters. A lot of them were found to have either been incited by law enforcement or by right-wing extremists or white supremacists. So that's actually been another issue, is a lot of people are trying to condemn, like, Black Lives Matter and these other important movements, trying to say, oh, they're just thugs who are destroying things. And the thing is, I mean, there are probably some people out there who have done that, but a lot of times, like, some of the bigger incidents, like burning down of buildings and such, I mean, some of those were done by the people I mentioned, law enforcement who are undercover, and extremists. So anyway, but to, again, the response to the sin of injustice will cause people to respond differently. We need to remember that we're all created in God's image, and pray for those with hardened hearts. As much as we might be angry at law enforcement, as much as we might be angry at these racists and extremists, we need to pray for those with these hardened hearts. The rioters, the government, law enforcement, praying for healing in our communities. Now, those are as far as, like, prayer. As far as, I guess, what you could say, action, I would say it's really important to advocate for criminal justice reform. That, of course, because, like, there's a lot of drug laws that have disproportionately affected Black communities and people of color nationwide. And they were put in place, like what you mentioned, Megan, that other person of color who was given a much harsher punishment. A lot of the laws are stacked against people to do that. And that happens all the time. So you could learn about the laws and who they affect. You can vote for officials that support criminal justice reform and run on a platform that promote actual justice. basically another thing I could mention here is praying for again back to prayer, praying for just immigration laws and processes that don't separate families. And as far as an action step for that, you can call and write your Congress people, your senators, and let them know like this is something that's happening and you want them to do something about it. We absolutely have the right and power to do that. So you could always reach out to your representatives. And then another one I think that really helps too a lot, that I think is kind of not thought of, well, people I think have got a little bit more too, but supporting minority owned businesses. A lot of businesses are run by immigrants. A lot of them, there's Black owned businesses, Native owned businesses. Support their work, buy their food, buy their art. That really helps their communities too. And so these are basically is kind of what my thoughts are on what we could do to help. Does anyone else have any kind of ideas of what we could possibly do to help, like either like create change, pray for change? Any thoughts like that before we wrap up? Okay, I'm gonna read Heather's comment. Fighting the principalities of prayer, large, big prayers. Jesus is bigger than the crimes of humanity. Yes, absolutely. We need to be praying. I think that's one of our first tool that we all have easily accessible is we can pray.
Also, I can say, pray like you mean it. Like, put your emotions behind it. Put your anger behind it, because like that's the only way that it's going to actually be released. And I think that really helps people too, the ones that are, I guess, the families of the victims that it happens to. Like, because I've known a lot of people where a lot of horrible things are happening, but not to them, to their family members, and they witness it. So it's pretty hard for them too. So it's just one big cycle of abuse within the system that was set up to be that way in the first place.
Yeah, definitely. Take that anger, that righteous anger, and use it to pray. Absolutely. And let's see. Does anyone else have any kind of thoughts? So, like anything else that we might be able to do?
Sharing a thought that I heard from James Butler, a Black staff in Colorado with InterVarsity, that like kind of the power of raising up other leaders of color and mentoring.
Yes, that is perfect. Absolutely. 100%. And it's been amazing actually this election year to see how many like people of color and women of color have been elected into positions of power. And I think that will really advocate for actual change too, which is so vital. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. That is absolutely important. Does anyone else want to share or have any thoughts at all about anything that we've discussed before we're done? Okay. So I think we're about out of time now, right? Megan or Amy? So I think I saw the little thing popping up on the screen.
Yeah, that's the end. Donnie's Diner is supposed to be opening up. I don't know if somebody's gone in there yet, if you want to hang out there. And then I believe the main session starts in half an hour.
Okay. So before we close, does anyone have any thoughts or input at all, real quick? Anything that we've discussed today?
I think you did a great job.
Thank you.
Thanks for bringing this topic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'm really glad I was able to share it. Thank you for the opportunity. Because I think this needs to be talked about a lot, and I just want to be able to like scream it from the mountaintops, like, this is happening and we have to do something about it. Because I am so sick of living on the border and hearing about this crap and having to see my own community suffer because of all of this ignorance and all this hate. I'm just sick of it. I'm angry. And I'm going to use that anger to pray, just like Heather was saying. So.
I'll say one more thing too. Remember, Jesus made a whip and cracked the whip in with in the synagogue, because that's not a place for that. And God is saying that's not a place for His kingdom either.
Yep.
Well, Megan, would you pray for Deanna, and we can close up this time, and I'll stop the recording.
Creator, thank you. Thank you for the good woman Deanna was raised by. Thank you that she set her feet firmly on a path of justice, and that Deanna has followed in those footsteps. I pray for each of us that we would find a step forward and then another one as we face issues that just feel insurmountable in systems that are bigger than we are. But we know that you are bigger than all of them. And so we call out to you to bring your kingdom to us here on earth. I pray that you would refill and renew Deanna throughout the day, help her to be ready for her next seminar, and just hold our hearts gently as we reflect on things that have been painful. Give us a good break, and pray for Randy and Edith as they prepare to lead us this afternoon. Amen.
Amen. Thanks everyone. Thank you, Deanna.
Oh yeah, and thank you all for being here. I'm really grateful, like I said, to be able to share this, and I hope that we can all move forward and see what we can do to help. And definitely pray. Everyone pray. Definitely, I think number one thing to start with is praying.
Amen.